Our next question comes from Connor Haven. A couple of weeks ago, Madeline, I asked whether CANZUK is being neglected by the political class. Why aren't more British politicians enthusiastically backing it?
Well, I think the idea of Britain, Canada, New Zealand and Australia working more closely together does have an obvious appeal. I think one of the reasons why it hasn't caught light is because people think, I'm afraid, I know this sounds terrible, of Canada and New Zealand as dull. And the politics...
But not Australia.
No, less Australia. The politics of collaboration with them seems, so sensible. It's like the well-behaved daughters in a Jane Austen novel. They're never going to attract attention. So it's almost as though, Canada's our friend anyway. New Zealand, we've got good relationships with anyway. America is the wicked seducer that we need to try to keep on board. Europe are the feuding relatives that we need to manage. We can rely on Canada, New Zealand and Australia anyway. So they suffer the sort of benign neglect that the non-prodigal son had to endure.
I would say, yeah, I think I very much agree with that. I would say, firstly, to Connor's question, that I think actually things are beginning to change on CANZUK. Kemi Badenoch came out in defence of it. And actually, interestingly, on his podcast with Tim Shipman and James Heal, Ben Judah, former advisor to David Lammy, said that it was also another idea that had been neglected and its time had come. So I think there is a bit of a growing consensus on both right and left that this is not an idea without its merits. I think you're right to raise the flashiness. I do think part of the appeal of America, the allure of America, comes from, frankly, the fact that quite a lot of the British press pack very much enjoy their trips to Washington, soaking up the grandeur of the Rose Garden, et cetera,
And West Wing syndrome.
Yeah, oh my God, yeah, don't get me started on that. But I think there's also, dare I say it, some historical illiteracy going on here. For example, I think it was either the time of the late Queen's funeral or it was the time of the King's coronation. I can't remember which. But there was some discourse about why it was that the Americans were sat so far back at Westminster Abbey. Now, if you understand our constitution, you know that the reason is that we've given priority to Commonwealth, perhaps countries that still retain the monarch as head of state, and possibly other monarchies too, who have family links with our own. So it's quite appropriate that Joe Biden should be sitting far behind the King of Norway and the Governor General of Antigua. That's completely appropriate. But a lot of American brain people were like, this is such an insult to us. But actually that's how things should operate and how we've always done things. I think that we've sometimes neglected our truest friends just by not understanding the history. For example, if you know about the Second World War, the way that Canada in particular offers, but all Canada, Australia, New Zealand, unconditional support throughout both world wars. Canada gives a massive gift. I think it's just money with no strings attached to pay for the war effort. Do people know about that? The narrative.
Do they know about the Dieppe Raid? Do they know about Vimy Ridge? Do they know about the Canadian lives that were lost in both the Second and the First World Wars?
The Battle of Britain, yeah.
I suspect that some people will be aware of Gallipoli, some people will be aware of the Anzacs, but I don't know if they will know the extent to which it was Australian and New Zealand troops that were in the Western Desert and that were integral to victory in Alamein, the extent to which there were Australian and New Zealand troops who were out in the forgotten war in Burma. It's certainly the case.
Absolutely vital. And Anzac Day, I went to the Anzac Day service, the most recent one, and it's a very moving ceremony. It begins very early in the morning, and it's held at the Arch, and it's a very emotional experience. But I do think this memory has been lost from most British experience. Perhaps it has something to do with the way that we teach history in schools with a massive focus on America.
I think it's partly that America has the glamour attached to being both the home of rebellion. Rebellion is always intrinsically more interesting than steadfast allyship, as it were. So if you look at the way in which a musical like Hamilton, which is people's minds, the loyalist case King George III and his
Courtier music for the court of Barack Obama, as somebody said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's depicted as bullying and or truckling, whereas all the glamour is with rebellion. So poor old Canada loses out. Australia, New Zealand, on the other side of the world, and such dependable allies so often that there is an element of those countries being taken for granted, which is why I think that you are right that appreciating not just the historic shared ties, but also the contemporary shared way of looking at the world matters. Because, Mark Carney made a speech, obviously, which was lauded at Davos, talking about middle powers, and people have parlayed that into a sort of rebuke to America. It was actually a rebuke to America, but putting that to one side, you do not need to believe that America needs rebuking, and you do not need to buy into every aspect of the Carney worldview to recognise that Canada, Australia and New Zealand are like-minded powers with whom we have a security and diplomatic relationship. Also, by the way, we're all members of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, or Trade and Prosperity Partnership, whatever, and along with a number of other explicitly Asian powers. So there are links that have strengthened. Boris secured trade deals with Australia and New Zealand, not hugely economically significant, but diplomatically important. So there are examples of the contemporary links being thickened and deepened. So I don't think it's an entirely neglected part of our diplomacy, but as you say, I think that it suffers from a certain lack of attention in the public eye because it doesn't have the glamour that so many British politicians have attached to American politics.
I would just add one more thing, which I think that it suffers from a blind spot on both left and right.
Yes.
So the left has a squeamishness about CANZUK because, again, it's that echo of perhaps the British Empire, the imperial hangover. So there's a disdain for any sign of obvious imperial preference, which goes really, really deep. Then you have a kind of general pro-Americanism that says, which we talked about, because we have the special relationship, we don't need these guys. And actually, I think there's some antipathy on the right because for them it's associated with the Commonwealth, and in some quarters the Commonwealth is associated with voting rights for Nigerians and Pakistanis.
Yes.
So I think that for a variety of reasons it has been neglected, but there are signs that may be changing.